Turn 2. The Dominion shatters. It began at the Colosseum. Only weeks before, the grand arena of white marble had stood as a fortress bristling with defenders. The Dawn Guard, Remnant, and Dark Choosing briefly united in defiance, together daring the Wa to come and test their resolve. Now, it stood empty. Bram Talos Incinerati had marched for a new posting outside Elisar City and were suffering bitter losses for it. The Bogsloggers had been hired off to defend Aiden's vaults, while the Lord of Whispers found Ginny's court embattled upon the Shimmer Sea. Valkara Crimsonforge conspired with Kavath Slaveborn to scour the Four Sisters with the fury of daemon constructs, while the Laughing Rats chased glory alongside the Bogsloggers. They and half a dozen others chased battle and glory across the Prime Dominion, leaving only Gorgonzola of the Bronze to defend the Colosseum. And he would not be enough. Rolling thunder betrayed their coming doom. Dozens of stone figures appeared, their tread shaking the Colosseum's very foundation, their baleful eyes hissing and spitting with rampant Wa energy. Swarming around their awkward, stomping stride came Coritha's horde and the Ma tribe of Jakang Weirdhulk. The woman warboss screamed her challenge, and the Bronze answered, his bloodbound slitting open their own skin in anticipation. The idols hit the Colosseum with the weight of an avalanche, splitting the arena open like a broken egg. Aside from the Bronze, the Wa had caught a delegation of Iskarian, come to treat with the Choosing. With nowhere to flee, they turned their blades on the Wildbone Ma tribe, intent on selling their lives at steep cost. As battle turned to mindless butchery, Coritha and Gorgonzola sought each other out, each circling their opponent like animals.
Are you the war boss of this rabble?
The Bronze questioned her. Close enough, she spat.
Close enough,
the Bronze grinned.
I will eat from the skull of a war boss this day.
Riding the winds etheric, dozens of Stormcast Eternals descended upon the Colosseum in a final effort to hold the line, yet were cast back to Azir upon bolts of azure lightning by the rampage of Killaboss Gazlock Blackstone. The defenders' fates appeared certain as above. Coritha harnessed rampant Wa energy to summon the bodies and souls of long-dead arena champions to throw themselves upon the Bronze and his warriors, while below, the Osiarch of Kataris Khan pursued their own ends. Ultimately, it was a dark miracle that would see Gorgonzola delivered. Even as he prepared to offer his own skull to Khorne's throne, the Wa energy in the air flickered like a candle being blown out. The idols fell dormant, and the Wild Bones and Blackstones backed away, each hoping the other would be the first to die. The Basalt Lord had arrived. His circle was the sixth, the Blades of Desolation, the hammer of the Ever-Chosen, taken up only to break apart the realms themselves. About him was his convoy, a dozen mounted knights belonging to the Basalt Lord's family clan. To look upon them was itself damnation, and to challenge them was certain death. Locked in final contest, Coritha and Gorgonzola stepped back from one another, gauging the newcomer even as the ground split open and caught flame beneath his daemon steed's hooves. The Basalt Lord removed his helm and regarded them with something leering and wrong that may have once been a smile.
You have been witnessed, Gorgonzola of the Bronze,
Karang San declared.
And you have been found worthy. Come, you shall be the first of my black pilgrims, and wreak greater havoc than this children's squabble.
His expression soured as he turned his gaze to Coritha.
Their stink is upon your soul, woman. The Eightfold Path is close to you. Never again will you rise above the company you now keep.
He sneered. and turned his steed away. The library of Galarian burned. Fully half the rogue idols awoken from Forholm had descended upon it, but they would not find it undefended. A beastman's soul, clad in lightning and sigmarite, sick bloodhorn, howled in fury and threw himself upon the emerald pilgrims, his beast cast butchering scores of the deluded ghouls in retribution for Silmer. The Duarden berserkers of Kargax Ebonheat's lodge met Tragrok Skullsmackers Shadow Trappers head-on, countercharging into the onrushing Uruks and refusing to yield so much as a single step back. Returning from patrol, the Coven of Twilight's blades set upon the stragglers, catching Tragrok and the Little Rin between the hammer and anvil of their witch elves and Kargak's stalwart fireslayers. Knight Incanter watched the battle unfold from above, mask impassive, betraying no emotion. This was to be their first battle, yet they knew it had not been. Instincts they didn't remember having spoke to them. Something was amiss. An Aetherwing lighted upon their gauntlet and spoke in a keening cry known only among the peaks of Azir. The message was from Quester Prime Sylvester Beaststalker and spoke a single word of warning. Infiltrate us. Ushered behind the library's gates even as the idols had made their approach, a convoy of supplies and esoteric lore revealed itself to be a Trojan horse, hijacked hours earlier by Cosma Wolfwin and aided by the shadow magics of Dol Gul the Wise to hide its true nature. The arcane shields and geomantic sigils keeping the rogue idols from finding purchase faltered as Uruks and undead fell upon the Iskarnath spellweavers, their blood splattering tomes thought lost since the age of myth. The indomitable and literate Maw tribe's tyrant Chungus howled in anguish and grief, his faithful Stonehorn Stabcat crushing the saboteurs as they spread through the halls of the great library. The little chonkers rallied to their tyrant's call, Mournfangs bowling over and Gargant cleavers rising and falling in bloody arcs. It was then that Attica appeared at his side, and Chungus snarled a protest as the Knight Arcanum seized the Ogrenomicon from the chains binding it to the tyrant's chest. They had smelled the reek of chaos upon it, yet this was a desperate time, and it called for a desperate measure. The library's walls were falling down around them, flames annihilating attacker and defender alike, the blazing eyes of rogue idols peering through the smoke. Reversing the seals of binding with a gesture and a barked cant, Attica hurled the tyrant's book at the attackers and watched as something else slithered from it. Having stalked and cornered the Knight Arcanum and eager for the kill, a torrent of blood splashed across Cosma and Dorlog, and from it, something horrible birthed itself into the library. Arms and legs of coiled sinew pulled themselves from a body of glistening meat as Spooky the Red Friend bellowed Khorne's fury. Bloodletters clawed their way out of the floor beside the Bloodthirster. Cosma's early butchery dangled before them like a sweetmeat. Panicked and scattering, Spooky turned hunters into the hunted, scouring the library for any who would harm Chungus's precious books. By the time a rogue idol crushed Spooky beneath its pounding fists, and Kuzma, Durlog, and Dolgu had finished banishing the bloodletters, they found only empty shelves among the library of Galarian. Seraph Dariel stood in the grand conclave, his brow furrowed in concentration. Hundreds of adjuncts, advisors, squires, and scribes scurried about. Servants offered up food and drink before clearing away cups and plates without ever being acknowledged by the champions, generals, and politicians they served. Representatives of the whole alliance stood and sat, debating, arguing. It was a necessary cacophony. Somewhere nearby, a Dawnhammer bombard battery fired. Its percussion felt more than heard. "Violence in variations," he spoke under his breath. "What?" responded Daybreak General Renea Oathsworn, rousing Dariel from his doldrums and interrupting the forced disposition she had been explaining. "Nothing." Dariel cleared his head. "Continue, please, Warden." The Seraph pictured the battles as flowers, some blossoming, some withering on the vine. The Colosseum and the library were gone, he would never again behold their wonders, lovingly raised by Yscarneth hands. The four sisters had been wholly returned to Seraphate control, utterly purged of a Skaven infestation by Daemon-forged monstrosities. War had ever been accompanied by strange bedfellows, and the choosing spoke of Twistflame and Rotspleen fighting side by side. Dariel couldn't help but wonder if a rotten seed hadn't been planted on their very doorstep. The Grimfangs had been scouting Amisra for something, apparently, and had brought marauding warbands of ogres and Skaven with them. The remnant had stood beside the undesired and fought them off, their deeds having made it all the way to Yscarneth high society by way of a ballad they called the Seven Spears of Darathus. Tanulia had been made safe again by Nurgle-blighted Sylvaneth, of all things. Left behind by some forgotten army that fought in the Civil War, cannibal cultists of Urbot had long plagued the Seraphate upon Tanulia, yet found themselves utterly overwhelmed by the Spore Song swarm. Victor Soliveg alone stood sentry upon Zalaria as squigs, spilled overboard from some earlier battle, washed up along its shores. Initially ignored as a nuisance, the beasts multiplied with terrifying speed and soon became a bounding squigalanche. Had they faced any foe but the implacable dead, they might have swept across the whole of Zalaria. Our Lady in Elisar was the latest moniker the Dawnguard had bestowed upon their warden, and it was in Elisar City that they had rallied after the fall of Sumer. Vaska of the Black Rose Coven and Leith Ashdon, the Lost One, had hardly rested in their vigilance, improvising ingenious and incendiary defense measures in the best traditions of Ruilar innovation. Time and again, war bands and spearheads probed the city, bleeding casualties from House Highsong and the Incinerati, or breaking upon the Guardian Legion without a real fight. Eager for battle, Renea had patrolled the lines herself, speaking privately with each and every commander there. When word reached them of the battles at the Colosseum and the library, Renea realized the Wall would not attack Elisar City without their idols, yet the defenders could not help but feel that it was only a matter of time before their reckoning came. "What of Corinth Skyport? Any word from our allies?" Dariel asked, gesturing to the map where Scrimshaw Orc Skull sat opposite a stone-carved mask impassive. "None," Renea said softly, and a long silence followed. Rudolph swore as he ducked down inside the turret of his steam tank. "How long does it take to turn some knobs?" he barked at his firemen. "We're almost finished. Just another minute or she'll burst at the seams." "We don't have another minute," Rudolph thought bleakly, before popping back up and blasting the face off a gibbering ghoul with his pistol. He made to reload before something made him stop, still as stone, locking eyes with a visage so horrible his worst nightmares could have never conceived of it. Silenor, the she-fiend of Silmer, just 500 yards away and closing fast. The tank commander ducked back inside his turret and screamed at his crew. "I don't give a damn! More pressure or we're cooked!" "We'll fly her apart!" the fireman protested, face slick with oil and sweat. "Then fly her apart!" Rudolph snapped back, their steam tank squealing in metallic pain as her crew opened the regulator and cracked the pressure gauge, pistons cranking as the steam tank began to pick up speed. Rudolph cast a glance over the hatch at the dread apparition behind them as his men frantically cranked the steam gun around, his tank holding her undivided attention. "Faster! Faster! Faster would be better!" Rudolph shouted and opened fire. It was the Exfentensis that kept the rout of Corinth Skyport from becoming a massacre. The Wall had allowed the defenders no time to recover. Although the rogue idols had moved off from the relentless barrage of the Dawnhammer bombards, the air remained electric with Wall energy, as though Mogrek Longblade himself looked down upon them. Eager for more savagery, the same despoilers whom had sacked Silmer had now come for the Skyport, and not even Siork Fishbane could stand before them. Lord Relicar Doran rallied the defense even as the murder of axes renewed their attack. Word had reached him of their Stormcast brethren of the Iron Templars marching to relieve them. They did not have to hold the line long, just long enough. Azoth Realmgorger would not allow him such a luxury. Invoking wicked blood rites of Kord, enabled by Gajak's butchery, the Chuglords rose from the spilled blood of the battlefield, breaking apart Doran's fragile battle line. Seeking to salvage the disaster, Darun challenged Silenor and was devoured by the creature, his sacrifice buying precious moments for his Stormcast to regroup. Newly arrived, fell to the Exfraternis to cover the Stormscale Covenant's retreat. Grim and disciplined, they fought without fear, ceding ground only after it had been sowed with the bodies of Ghoul, Ogre, and Daemon alike. Although the Iron Templars would grant them a respite to withdraw, the Skyport's fate was sealed. Their actions had simply bought the Pterodon riders of the Excantilitolian time to summon the Caradron of the Abel Alban Baking Company to complete the evacuation. When Azoth and Silenor finally claimed their second prize, it was empty upon arrival, their foe airborne and beyond their reach.
The Colosseum, destroyed. Library of Galarian, destroyed. Corinth Skyport, destroyed. The shadow of Noctis fought with the iridescent glow of the Shimmer Sea. The advancing warships, stark silhouettes, ominous against the gloam. They seemed to think themselves a pack of alopecs, circling their cornered prey. That was exactly what Admiral Soroya wanted. The Iskarnath fleet had made itself up as a wounded animal, Soroya's flagship surrounded by vessels severely damaged in the previous engagement and moored in the shallows with seemingly no escape. And Sharkbiter was swimming right into her net. Captain Sharkbiter, for his part, did not expect anything but an easy slaughter as he closed in upon the wounded fleet. It was almost disappointing. His disappointment would not last. From all across the treacherous narrows and hidden channels of the shards of Weirneth, horns, gongs, and bells sounded out to each other, signaling the ambush. The ships of the Iskarnath Alliance braved the straits to surround the Wa Armada. Bellicose orc taunts and jeers turned to shouts of alarm and calls to arms. Sharkbiter grinned. This was more like it. After all, the fleet was still protected by the Everwinter, and no desperate ambush would slow the Wa's momentum. Then the fires came. From behind a shattered hillside, still bearing the crumbled ruins of a Weirneth homestead and decorated with the yellowing longhorn bones, a Dawnguard ship under the command of the Templars of our burning savior towed a chain-lashed metalith. The floating island bore upon it a realm-shaper engine, the stone edifice shimmering with heat. On the prow of the ship, the promised conflagration, the Zengor Azavash the Serene raised her arms, golden armor gleaming as the metalith at her back burst into flame. All across the shards of Weirneth, fires erupted from the shattered landscape as runic enchantments and Zeechian sigils reacted to the metalith's activation. On that lonely hillside, long-forgotten bones turned to ash. In the sky above, a vast storm cloud gathered. It was no ordinary storm cloud, however, and upon it was gathered a vast Lumineth host led by the wind mage Eladric, who even now shaped a maelstrom of Weirneth's roiling skies. Alongside Koyo of the Black Lotus Combine on her own vessel below, Eladric wove together gale and flame into a wind-born inferno that tore into the Wa fleet. Only the Everwinter saved the flotilla from annihilation, the arcane chill absorbing the heat before it could burn away the wooden hulls. Sharkbiter's armada had not been destroyed, but they found themselves suddenly exposed. Worse, the fires still raged about them, directed by Iskarnath wind mages to burn away any retaliatory artillery fire. Grucker Redtooth and his crew, suddenly finding themselves surrounded, their ship boarded by soul-blight vampires from the decaying Ost, raised their blades with a roar. With savage glee, they set about repelling their vampiric boarders, the decks slick with blood. Above them, more clouds began to gather as the elemental forces of ice and flame warred. It provided the perfect cover for the Wa's own ploy. In the sky, hidden even from Aldrich's Lumineth host, the Caradron Company MERC's skyships swept in. Under escort from the mercenary Iron Fang fleet, they carried a truly vile payload. Acolyte Blisterpaw rode upon the MERC flagship, readying the deployment of a grand cauldron of plague brew, its vile contents mixed with the magics of the Great Corruptor, alongside other ingredients of ghoulish, Uruk, and ogre origin, among other esoteric effluvia. Similar cauldrons were held below each of the rest of the skyships. At Blisterpaw's command, the noxious slop was loosed, raining down upon the foe. Lumineth, riding clouds down to the battle below their lofty perch, screamed as their skin blistered and melted away under the rain. Many dove towards the Shimmer Sea in search of relief that they would not find, their careful formations thrown into chaos. In some places, the fluid seemed to redirect itself as it fell, momentarily forming into the shape of a peculiar masked grot as it hurtled towards the most choice targets. Reeling from the attack, the undesired contingent of the Iskarneth fleet launched a desperate counteroffensive so audacious that, in the aftermath, many considered it to be some form of mass hallucination triggered by the noxious gases of the plague rain. From unburned isles around the roiling sea, as well as the living hull of Sleeket's Fang's resurrected Leviathan flagship, magically propelled gore-grunters, lashed with Skyer weaponry, launched into the sky toward the Caradron fleet above. At their head, Phaethon the War Mother roared as her grunter hurled through the air, spewing warp-infused ordnance. Seeing the perfect time to deploy their own tactic, wizards from the armies of Azir, led by Lord Celis and Vitrevius Hearthborn, harnessed the brewing storm, wreathing their airborne allies in crackling coronas of pure azurite lightning, infusing the muscles of the undesired Uruks and their porcine mounts with energy beyond anything they'd felt before. Many of the flying hogs collided directly with the hulls of the Caradron vessels, tearing through them like bullets. Those riders who survived the impact leapt forth, lightning-wreathed brutes charging across shattered decks with blades in hand. Among them were Leviathan herself, alongside the Dawn Guard's Varric the Wall. On the burning sea below, Sharkbiter's fleet found themselves beset by foes from all sides. Their ships swarmed by the spectral hosts of Ginny of Oldstone. Uruk, Ogre, and Grot sailors found themselves fighting for their lives as Nighthaunt screamed across their prows. With a snarl, Captain Sharkbiter called the retreat, his ships desperately maneuvering out of the narrows they'd found themselves trapped in. As they broke away, the Armada found themselves beset by one more calamity, as the Dark Choosing's burning chorus gathered along the shattered coasts to call forth a noxious wind, choking the fleeing Uruks. As the sailors reeled, the Maggotkin of the mournful choir tore a rift in the sundered sky, summoning forth hordes of fetid plague drones, bearing bloated beasts of Nurgle to rain upon the fleeing ships, sinking a few and leaving others with pestilent stowaways bounding about their decks, wreaking havoc as they went. Despite all this, many War vessels, both upon the sea and in the sky above, managed to escape, limping but alive. The Iskarneth allied forces were not left unharmed either, the plague rain having caused untold damage to vessels and sailors alike. The triage ships of the Black Lotus Combine were overrun with victims of the noxious deluge, and even Admiral Soraya herself had not been spared. She grimaced as her right eye burned away and weeping blood and pus was sterilized. The pain was excruciating, but she set her jaw and bore it. Both sides had suffered tremendously, but the Alliance had come out on top, at least for now. The war at sea was reaching its climax, and she would be ready to face it. And when that time came, the Admiral swore, she would gut that cur Sharkbiter herself. Seraphate, lesser victory.
The quill scratched across the paper in short, quick, impatient strikes, leaving scars of black ink across its surface. There was no artistry in their lines, no grace or culture. There was no poetry in the words they formed. It was the plain and brutal algebra of war. Spear tips and medical gauze, transport boats and lives, where they would hoard and where they would spend. Casualty reports and expense forms signed on the same line and all recorded in Aiden's ledger. Everything was there. Every transaction, every loss down to the bayonet bolt. A war reduced to pure numbers. Dust fell from the shaking ceiling, fouling the long line of small, precise figures, and Aiden scowled. The quill tip had broken on the coarse debris, leaving a blot of ink obscuring the final summation. He cast a quick eye over the desk, but there was not a spare quill at hand. It couldn't be helped. Daryl would need to make that final figure for himself. Spreading a quick dusting of sand across the page to absorb any ink that had not yet dried, he snapped his fingers and a small glimmer owl appeared, perched on the edge of the desk. The magical construct looked at him with curiosity as he shook the ledger clean, wrapping it tightly with a leather cord and sealing its edges with wax. Aiden opened the desk drawer and pulled a small tin of dried fish free, carefully feeding one to the glowing bird. For a moment, he thought it oddly unsatisfying that there were more fish in the tin left that had not been the last one. That would have been more poetic. He grunted at himself, dismissing the fancy. It was simply wasteful, was all. That half a box of fish would never be used. He held up the sealed ledger, and the glimmer owl leapt into the air, circling him once before picking it up and disappearing in an azure haze. It would take the ledger to Iscarion, and then... well, it did not really matter after that. The noise around him increased, and more dust fell from the ceiling. The office shook with the marching feet of the invaders on the plains above. Aiden the Auric rose and picked up the great axe that had been leaning on the table beside him. Overhead, the armies of Wa Mogric stomped and roared, throwing clouds of dust in the air and the ringing beat of the Wa drummers bouncing off the mountainsides. They had discovered the location of the vault quite by accident when one of the lesser chieftains noticed an unusual number of weird knobs were exploding. This usually meant an unusual concentration of magical energies were nearby, and it soon became a simple matter of following the explosions as they honed in on its source. Now, the horde stood across the broad basin valley from the once hidden vault. The defenders wasted little time, arraying before the vault entrance like a glittering host from the days of yore. The Hessian light gleamed off polished helms and glittering lances, but they seemed a paltry few to the ranks of greenskins arrayed against them. Noise erupted among the invaders' ranks, loud enough to be heard even above the bellowing and stamping Uruks. A procession had begun in the midst, shoving each other aside to make room. A marching band of drummers, rabble-rousers, bellowers, and magically bolstered musicians of all kinds reveled, driving the fighting spirits of the Wa to greater heights. They attacked like a storm breaking across the plain. Magical gravitech traps laid by the Seraphon sprang to life, throwing raging Uruks and bellowing pigs high into the air or slamming them to the ground, but it did little to deter the momentum of such a force. The wall building around them was so strong that most simply stood up and kept marching. The frost-gleaming death knights of the White Host rode out to meet the charge, cutting into the flanks, but they could not break the charge, and soon were forced to quit the field. The Hyaki Yagul stood like breakwater pillars amidst the charge, smashing down terrible destruction all around them, but the horde flowed around them in spite. The very ground the Gargant stood on writhed and grasped at the invaders, twisting and corrupted by the chaotic nexus that had been called forth by the shadow-sworn host. For a moment, it seemed like the charge had been blunted, mired by the churning and mutating earth, when dozens of gnashing fiery jaws burst forth from the maw-pots of the Cold-Cut tribe. Streaks of blazing arcane fury traced across the plains, burning tracks through grass and mutated growth alike, and the Wa surged across these ashen paths once more. With a crash, they reached the thin line guarding the vault's entrance. Warp-block fire echoed from both sides, cutting down attackers and defenders with equal indifference. Chimera Brayherd roared and challenged, their massive, bulky forms dwarfing the Skaven before them, before each side fell on each other in bestial frenzy. The odd bogsloggers had peered like demons of the fog amidst the long rifles and great cannons of the defenders, wreaking a horrific slaughter among the unprepared crews before being charged down by Atir Blackblade and his chosen warriors. Vashkora fought like a lion, a last line of defense before the beleaguered gunners. Front and center, before the gates of the vault, an unlikely group fought like ancient heroes. The Tree Lord Dinwar stood like a mighty oak against the tempest, turning aside attack after attack. Quillock Killwhisker skittered across his back, mad warplock weaponry spitting death out in all directions. Gaharian the Fire Mage leapt and weaved, calling walls of flame down around them. Marshal Marcel rode up and down the lines, steadying free guilders and allied troops alike, and for a moment it seemed that the horde had been stopped. Charging orcs faltered, their momentum lost, and they took an unsteady step backwards. The defenders looked at each other in relief, then noticed the shadows that had fallen across them. Casting their eyes upwards, what they had thought was salvation turned to despair. A Caradron frigate was skewing through the air, fires erupting across its deck and its largest engine. Duarden and Skaven fought across the deck, small arms fire ringing constantly across its brass hull or finding purchase punching deeper into the engine works. Flames wreathed it like a comet as the large airship came crashing down into the side of the valley wall, punching a hole through the vault entrance and carving a deep path into the chambers below. A shockwave of sound erupted from the battlefield, pushing back attacker and defender alike, and for a moment the valley turned quiet. Only a moment, however, until with a mighty wah, the greenskins charged once more. Deep beneath the earth, another battle had erupted. Emerging from ancient disused lindworm tunnels and harnessing Troggoth rock movers, Soto and his crew punched through the wall and found themselves standing in a vast carved chamber. They were one of many crews chosen to assault the vaults from beneath. Relics and strange artifacts rest on runic pillars spaced evenly throughout the room. Some were identifiable, like a draconith egg that sat beside a sealed note from the Civil War. Others were a complete mystery, their form giving no clue to their function, at least to the Auric pirates that gazed at them now. One of the ogres that had accompanied them reached for a carved tooth, picking it up without hesitation. A brief moment of panic passed across his face before his eyes went white and vacant, and, snatching up a cleaver, he cut his hand clean off. This made little impact on the Trog boss, Mudglut, who absent-mindedly wandered the aisles, plucking up interesting-looking treasures to snack on, while Markella Viercross studied each with a critical eye, searching for something she could not yet describe. Soto and his lads crept carefully across the chamber towards a large gem set at its center. Light fell off it like a fountain's water, washing over the treasury. Soto reached out covetously, nearly touching the gem, when some deep-rooted instinct pulled back his hand. That moment saved his life, as half a second later, a Fire Slayer axe whistled through the air where his head had been. With thundering Khalazad war cries, the Sanguine Lodge erupted onto the attackers. They were at home here among the vault, deep beneath the earth and surrounded by golden treasures, and they reveled in the carnage. Driving the invaders before them, they pushed deeper and deeper into the vaults. Gore-drenched Nighthaunt emerged from the stone passages, swiping at the panicked orcs with chill ethereal claws. Shrieking Gits spilled like wildfire through the hall, battling with the servants of the Crow wherever they met. A fresh relief force of allied defenders charged down through the upper corridors, forcing the invaders down towards the counting room. Not all the reinforcements seemed equally interested in pursuing the Oryx, however. Kavath Slaveborn's wild tribesmen fought tooth and nail with raging Troggoths in the dark and twisting passages, while their erstwhile avian cultist allies instead took to gathering as much loot as possible. Squirm Packmaker and his gutter runners scurried through the halls, leaving their clan rats to fight and die while they found the best pieces of magical treasure. Even the Fangs of Garm mercenaries left their posts to gather what they could find, leaving several key exit points purposely open for easier looting. None of that mattered to Ghostface. The Skaven leader had prepared the counting room as the killing field, directing all their allies to drive the invaders down to that point. Carefully stacked crates contained coins packed in neat rows, bearing every mark and vintage known to the mortal realms. Clan Scorched Fur warriors milled uneasily at the center of the room, unaware that they were nothing more than bait. As were all these so-called allies, the Skaven thought with a wicked grin. If the underside were to fall, better to burn everything all the same. The invaders began pouring into the counting room, pushed from all sides by the Alliance counterattack. He let them come, let them fall upon the clan rats now trapped in the room's center. Then, with a claw, he gave the signal. Warp block fire rang out, some striking the attackers, but most finding the warpstone explosives that had been placed throughout the room. There was a flash of green light, painfully bright for a moment. It caught a single, frozen moment in time, seared into the Skaven's brain. Shards of scattered coin, glowing hot, were scything through Orc and Skaven and Duarden alike, cutting down everything in the room. From every corner of the room, every pile had been turned into a hurricane of burning shrapnel. The Auric's own horde turned to the greatest murder weapon Ghostface had ever seen. He would cherish this memory, even when his sight returned. Then, in the silence that followed, Hallspire opened the phylactery of souls gathered at the slaughtered cities in the war above. The fresh dead began to twitch, then rise. Marching together, Ulrich and Duarden and Skaven alike, they pulled their broken forms across shattered ground and rose up through the vaults. The army of the recently dead met with the invaders at the wreck of the burning frigate, yet every greenskin that died added a fresh recruit. When the bodies of a trio of gatecrasher gargants slain by Dinwar and their allies began to twitch and rise, it was the breaking point for the invaders. The wall broke, fleeing back across the plains, unaware that the remnant ritual was at the very edge of its power. Its power unraveling, and the dead falling dead once more, the defenders were left to gather what victory they could find, costly though it had been.
Seraphate, lesser victory! Far beyond the perimeter inimical, where light and thought became indistinguishable, an idea that had once been a man might have nodded to itself in satisfaction had his body remained. Whatever happened next, he had played his part. The thing which must never be known would become Aiden's burden now. The Tetrarchy had been chanting for hours, speaking without lips or tongues. As one, they stopped, and silence spoke instead. A soul drifted before them and waited dutifully.
Summon our supplicants, my dear,
Mithridates Burr said softly.
we begin.
The skies over Iskarion churned. Red spilled across it like blood, then the angry purples of a rotten bruise, before blackness consumed it all. Upon the floating metallith he had commandeered for his own use, the Mooncaller giggled. It had taken power that neither of them had known they had, casting and capering and chanting for days without pause. Their feet bled, sticking to the rock with each wet step. But they had done it. They had brought night to the city of dawn. A sickly yellow light shone across the mask, and as the once Grot looked upwards, an awful, grinning face appeared, rising like a kraken from the inky night sky. It was glorious and terrifying. The bad moon was on the rise.